unmute myself so the Zoom folks can hear us. I'm not going to click leave meeting. Okay. Jeremy, does it look like we're up and running then? Very good.
Good, yes.
Okay. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you for the invitation, and especially to Patty and the other Patty and Patricia for all of their help in organizing this, and to David Richards also at the Margaret Chase Smith Library here. I loved coming here tonight for so many reasons, one of which is I think that Margaret Chase Smith and Lydia Maria Child would have been fascinated by each other. I don't know that they would have agreed about everything, but I think they were both very strong women who chafed against the limitations of being a woman at a time that made them more powerful insofar as they had to overcome some adversity in order to achieve what they wanted to achieve. Just very quickly, I do have some books for sale in the back. The way I love to do these book readings is that I try to do something that Lydia Maria Child loved to do, which was to use her writing to raise money for causes that she cared about. So if you buy a book tonight, the proceeds will go. I'm going to divide them between Doctors Without Borders, which is an organization that I feel very supportive of and who is working hard in both the major war zones that we are also disturbed by at the moment, and Wabanaki Reach, which is an organization some of you might know about, run by the Wabanaki tribes. And I've learned so much from them in my time at Colby, both in my teaching and then also in my research. And as you'll hear, part of Lydia Maria Child's story in this part of the world in particular intersects with the Wabanaki themselves. So it feels right to me to support them through talking about Child. And I want to talk about Child as a way of thinking about someone who had a lifelong commitment to fighting for the ideals of the country that she loved. And I think we're living at another time now where that kind of determination and fight is really needed. One of the things I want to do tonight is sketch out an arc of her life from when she was very young, living in Norridgewock, to the end of the Civil War, when she would have been in her 60s, as a way of just reminding ourselves what it takes to sustain a kind of commitment to those political principles over a lifetime and in the face of real opposition and moments where things seemed very dark. So that's part of the framework of what I wanted to set up for tonight. And then today, as I was thinking about how I wanted to frame my remarks a little bit more particularly, I came across this fact on social media, which is that today, April 9th, is the anniversary of the day that Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant and the Civil War began to end. It was not the absolute end of the war, but it was the biggest moment that made it clear that the war would end soon. So this is the statement that Robert E. Lee sent to Ulysses S. Grant. I ask a suspension of hostilities pending the discussion of the terms of surrender of this army. So that felt like an auspicious way to talk about someone whose lifelong passions were played out on the battlefield of the Civil War, as well as on many other fronts too. So where I want to start is with Lydia Maria Frances Child, who was born in 1802 in Medford, Massachusetts. So her given name was just Lydia Frances. She didn't like the name Lydia. I try not to take that personally. So when she was a young adult, she actually asked to change it. She added Mariah as a middle name and then asked people to call her that. So you'll hear me refer to her as both as I go through her lifetime. And she was born to a baker and his wife in Medford. They were not at all intellectuals. They had very little use for education, especially for their daughters. But they had one son named Converse who was extremely bookish. And he was so bookish, I love this anecdote, that the family doctor finally told his parents that he was going to be of no use to them in the bakery. So they may as well send him to Harvard. So they did that. He went to Harvard and he became a very well-known divinity school professor at Harvard later in his life. he introduced his little sister to books, and they had these wonderful evocations of her coming home from school and rushing up to his bedroom, throwing herself on the floor, and they're just immersing themselves in Shakespeare and Milton in a kind of world of ideas and reading that clearly set her on her life's path. When she was 12, their mother died, and she was sent to Norridgewock, Maine to live with a sister. So this was a period of enormous loss for her. Obviously, not only had her mother died, but also one of her grandmothers had died, one of her sisters died. And then it just seemed that her father didn't have the intellectual or emotional energy to single parent a very precocious 12-year-old. So she was sent north. So what I want to do now is I'm going to read a little bit. I'm going to stop and talk about her a little bit, and then I'm going to read a little more, and we'll see how the evening unfolds here. As an adult, Lydia Francis never recorded why she was sent to Maine or how she got there. There was a ship that went from Boston to Portland and a stagecoach from Portland into Maine's interior. Perhaps that was how. It would have been a terrible journey for someone so young to make alone, but she might have. After days of travel, she finally arrived in Norridgewock, a picturesque settlement on the banks of the Kennebec River. Her sister, Mary Preston, had just given birth to a baby, the first of 5 born over the next several years. Mary certainly could make use of another pair of hands, and Lydia's later experience in household matters suggests that she kept her sister busy. Norridgewock was well established, but provisions would have been in short supply and deliveries from elsewhere unknown. Living in Maine meant knowing how to make do. By the time she returned to Massachusetts 5 years later, Lydia could sew beautifully and cook competently. She also could tell very good children's stories, a technique perhaps honed with one Preston child or another nestled on her lap. The Preston family lived on the north side of the river, where there was a courthouse, a hotel, and a jail. Mary's husband, Warren Preston, was a lawyer from Massachusetts who had resolved to try his legal skills in the wider, wilder world of Maine. His professional position in the town meant that Lydia, perhaps as she helped her sister serve her husband's friends or tended a fire in the room where they talked, could listen in as they discussed pressing issues of the day. Perhaps Warren, like her brother Converse, enjoyed having a young, eager listener who would hang on his every word, always wanting to know more. More important for Lydia's development, Warren Preston was helping Norridgewock found its first library and was serving as its librarian. There's no record that the librarian's teenage sister-in-law borrowed books, but we know she was reading them. This is because in June 1817, the following letter burst out of the Maine woods addressed to Converse, who was now studying at Harvard Divinity School. My dear brother, it began, I have been busily engaged in reading Paradise Lost. Homer hurried me along with rapid impetuosity. Every passion that he portrayed, I felt. I loved, hated, and resented just as he inspired me. But when I read Milton, I felt elevated above this visible diurnal sphere. I could not but admire such astonishing grandeur of description, such heavenly sublimity of style. I never read a poem that displayed more prolific fancy or a more vigorous genius. This is the earliest surviving letter by Lydia Francis. Its author was 15 years old. The Maine woods were vast. Compared with Medford's placid Mystic River, the Kennebec roared and swelled, sometimes sweeping away whole bridges as winter snows melted. She had always loved the springtime flowers and delicate birds in her parents' garden, but here in Maine, nature was uncultivated and sublime. Her intellectual adventurousness kept pace with her surroundings. By this time, she was reading Walter Scott. Scott's evocations of Scotland's magnificent landscapes, fierce heroines, and tragic conflicts were a perfect accompaniment to her new environment. They also appealed to her emerging personality. In my very early youth, she later recalled, I loved scenes tinged with melancholy. They were a pleasant contrast to the excessive gaiety of my own buoyant spirit. Maine's history felt raw too. The year she arrived in Norridgewock, evidence of a gruesome chapter in this history was literally unearthed when a storm brought down a tree a few miles from town. Buried among its roots was a church bell that had survived a 1724 massacre of Abenaki Indians and their French priest, Sebastian Rail. The British troops had attacked without warning and murdered some 80 people, among them dozens of women and children. The intention was to decimate the native population and scare off the French settlers who were allied with them. By the time the bell was rediscovered 100 years later, both missions had largely been accomplished. The French had been driven into Canada, and the Abenaki had been reduced to a fraction of the mighty, populous people they had been. But they were still there, and Lydia Francis was curious. Somehow, in the midst of childcare and household duties, she found time to seek them out in the hemlock forests near the river. She watched them dyeing wood strips and weaving them into baskets. She also joined them for meals and listened to their stories, absorbing a worldview and an aesthetic entirely different from her own. She met one of their chiefs and remembered decades later that his young warrior nephew reminded her of a god. She also recounted watching a native woman who had given birth the night before walk through the snow with vigorous strides, a sack of potatoes on her shoulder and her baby on her back. These interactions apparently led the inquisitive teenager to a few conclusions. One was that the native peoples of America had been grievously wronged. If her later fiction is any indication, the story of the Norridgewock massacre, together with the hardship still endured by the survivors' descendants, clearly haunted her. But the other conclusion was that these native peoples were spirited, generous, and wise, possessing dignity and resilience that many in her own culture lacked. The winters in Maine were brutal, and summers were not much better. The second year she lived in Norridgewock, there was snow in June and frost every month of the year. As Mainers struggled with epic blizzards and heaving ice, the sultry sugarcane fields of the South and the enslaved humans who worked them must have seemed a world away. But in 1819, the topic of slavery burst upon Maine residents in a way that would mark their and their country's history forever. This was because Maine was still officially part of Massachusetts. Now, after decades of irritation with an alternately negligent and overbearing Boston government, it was staging its own bid for independence. Legal experts were consulted, newspapers opined, petitions were organized. Warren Preston, Lydia's brother-in-law, was among those who favored separation. No doubt she heard his reasons articulated in the lively debates that preoccupied the state's residents at the beginning of 1819. Finally, a region-wide vote was scheduled. In July of that year, a majority of Mainers voted to apply to Congress for statehood. Approval should have been a formality. Instead, Maine's request triggered a political crisis that quickly threatened the country's still fragile union. The United States consisted at this point of 11 free states and 11 slave states. Adding Maine would tip the balance in the Senate in favor of free states. Unwilling to allow this threat to their power, Southern legislators proposed making Maine's admission contingent on adding Missouri as a slave state. Maine's independence, it suddenly became clear, would have a moral cost. It would come at the price of expanding slavery. Mainer's political freedom would ensure other humans' physical enslavement. Some Mainers, at least, reacted with horror, condemning the idea as the moral compromise it was. Delegates to Maine's Constitutional Convention initially agreed that they would rather postpone independence than become a mere pack horse to transport the odious anti-Republican principle of slavery farther into the country. The Portland Gazette agreed, urging the delegation to hold fast to their political integrity. For as much as we wish success to the Maine bill, we confess we had rather it would sink than bear up so wicked a freight as the slavery of Missouri. But in the end, Maynard's desire for independence won out over their qualms about others' enslavement. The deal was struck, and the Missouri Compromise was approved. In March 1820, Maine was admitted as the United States' 23rd state. The next year, Missouri was admitted as the 24th. As part of the compromise, slavery was prohibited anywhere above the 36th parallel, Missouri accepted. Northern politicians could assure their anti-slavery constituents that, despite the compromise, slavery would from this point on be contained forever. Apparently, that was assurance enough for most white Northerners to go back to living their lives as before and to forget again about slavery. Future Maine Senator John Holmes proudly sent a copy of his defense of the compromise to the aging Thomas Jefferson, now enjoying his retirement at Monticello. Jefferson wrote back, praising Holmes's effective and persuasive reasoning. But about the question that Maine's bid for independence had broached, whether and how and where slavery should be allowed to expand, he was less sanguine. This momentous question, like the fire bell in the night, awakened and filled me with terror, he wrote to Holmes. I considered it at once as the knell of the Union. The United States had won a reprieve only, he said. The issue would be back. Jefferson then paused to admire his own dislike of slavery. Like his Maine contemporaries, he was, he said, as much against it as anyone. I can say with conscientious truth that there is not a man on earth who would sacrifice more than I would to relieve this heavy burden and reproach in any practicable way, he wrote. The cession of that kind of property would not cost me a second thought if, in that way, a general emancipation and expatriation could be effected. Note the emphasis on expatriation. In Jefferson's mind, even if Africans and their descendants could be emancipated, they would have to be sent away. But since neither freedom nor exile was possible, there was nothing to be done. As it is, he regretted, we have the wolf by the ear, and we can neither hold him nor safely let him go. Justice is on one scale and self-preservation on the other. It would all, he predicted, end badly. My only consolation is to be, this founding father wrote, that I live not to weep over it. Perhaps Jefferson actually believed there was no man on earth who would sacrifice more to end slavery than he would. It is also true that when he died 6 years later, he left behind over 150 slaves, 130 of whom were sold to pay the debts he had accrued living the life of a Virginia gentleman. Some of them were children who probably never saw their families again. So that was the political environment that Lydia Francis at that point lived in as a teenager. She went on in her early 20s to take a school in Gardner, Maine, very briefly, and then moved back to Massachusetts to live with her brother and his new wife. And she, at that point, went from being a prodigious reader to a prodigious writer. So her first novel, she published at the age of 22, was inspired by Native American history. It was called Hobomok, a tale of early times, and it portrayed a native warrior who marries a European settler, and they get into a kind of love triangle. They have a biracial child. The Native American warrior, eventually leaves in deference to the white man's claim. So it's a book that involves an interracial marriage, a biracial child, a kind of divorce. I mean, there wasn't really a taboo she wasn't breaking in writing this novel. It's another indication of her early courage around these things. And the book did well after a while. It did well enough that it really launched her into Boston high society. So for a couple of years anyway, she was called a literary lion Everybody was very curious about this young woman who'd emerged from the forests of Maine, writing about Native Americans with clearly some rather controversial opinions. And she leveraged that into more fame. She wrote another novel. She started to write children's literature, which was extremely successful. She was the first editor of a periodical for children in the United States called the Juvenile Miscellany. This was the kind of periodical that people well into their adulthood could remember waiting for as children. And mothers would say, oh, I know what that noise is on the stoop. It's that the miscellany has come. And this was popular up and down the coast. It was sold in the South as well. So I would say that by the time she was in her mid-20s, she was the 19th century equivalent of a household name. People knew who she was and were eager to hear more. She, in 1828, married a man named David Lee Child, who was an author himself, but also a lawyer and a journalist. He had very radical political opinions, more radical than hers. They had a lifelong companionship interrupted, unfortunately, fairly regularly by very bad financial decisions on his part. He was a wonderful person and a walking financial disaster. But this is an important development in her life. I'm going to see if I can get rid of this. Thank you. And then in 1829, she published something called The American Frugal Housewife. I love the subtitle to this book, dedicated to those who are not ashamed of economy. If you think about it, this doesn't bode well for her financial situation. Already her husband's schemes had gotten them into some debt, but she had decided that she wanted to write a cookbook and a household book for American women and for women who were not aristocrats, who were not among the elite, but who were willing to be Americans in the sense of being self-reliant. So one of the things that she feared very early in her life was that Americans would slip back into a kind of class-based society of the kind that we had just fought a Revolutionary War to get rid of. So the book is full of things like how to cure a sprained ankle, how to get rid of bed bugs, how to cook a goose. One of my favorite details is when she says, you know that a roast pig is half done when the eyeballs pop out. So just remember that when next time you roast a pig. This book sold, I think it was 12 editions in the first couple of years. It was also the kind of book that people in their adulthood would tell her that they remembered their mother's copies of it. Someone said to me recently that she was the Martha Stewart of her generation. So all of that to say that, again, she was very well known as something that was very unusual at that point, which was a self-sufficient female author. In 1830, she met a man that some of you might recognize named William Lloyd Garrison. Garrison was one of the most important white abolitionists in Boston. It's really important for us at this remove to grapple with the fact that to be an abolitionist at this point in history, first of all, it meant to advocate for the immediate and not the gradual end of slavery, and to argue for the end of slavery without compensation to enslavers. This was the kind of opinion that would get you branded a social pariah. It was the kind of thing that could get you ostracized from Boston polite society, which was still very entrenched in the idea of holding up appearances and not upsetting the South in a way that would precipitate conflict. But Garrison was having none of that. He was a real radical in every sense of the word. He had heard of Child. He knew that she had a novelist sensibility, that she was very good at dispensing practical advice, and that she had a very wide following. And he decided to try to recruit her to the abolitionist cause. And this is what she says about what happened. I was then all absorbed in poetry and painting, soaring aloft on psyche wings into the ethereal regions of mysticism. Garrison got hold of the strings of my conscience and pulled me into reforms. It is of no use to imagine what might have been if I had never met him. Old dreams vanished, old associates departed, and all things became new. I could not otherwise, so help me God. So it was really a conversion experience. She's clearly describing it that way. She wrote about it in that way in other places as well. It was a moment after which she couldn't live her life the same way again. She had realized the evil of slavery. She realized that she as an American had a duty to address that. And she decided to devote the rest of her life to doing it in every way she could. So the question for her was what she had to devote to the cause. And she ultimately decided that it was her reputation. So she spent the next 3 years researching and writing a book called An Appeal in Favor of That Class of Americans Called Africans. This is a book that has chapters on the economics of slavery, on the politics of slavery, moral arguments against slavery, arguments for the intellectual character and the moral character of Africans and their descendants. These were all spheres that women were really not supposed to be mixing in. It was one thing for her to write a household manual, but to be giving her politicians and statesmen advice, that was another line people didn't want her to cross. You can see there on your right, this is an image from the book that depicts the kind of torture devices that were used on enslaved people. That was also considered really indecent to talk about that kind of physical torment in polite society. And then the last chapter of this book is about Northern racism. And the first chapter of that, the first sentence of that chapter goes something like this: while we bestow our earnest disapprobation on our brethren in the South, let us not flatter ourselves that we are any better than they. And then she goes on to chronicle all of the instances of racism that she had seen in schools, in churches, on stagecoaches, sort of racial epithets that she had heard in the streets. And she makes the argument that Southern slavery would not survive without Northern complacency and Northern complicity. And as you can imagine, this is not what your average Bostonian wanted to hear. And indeed, very shortly thereafter, her ostracism began. So she was essentially kicked out of Boston polite society. George Ticknor, who was a kind of kingmaker in Boston, ordered people to stop speaking to her and stop reading her books. Here are a couple of quotes from that period. Mrs. Child was denounced. The politicians and statesmen scouted the woman who had presumed to criticize so freely the Constitution and government of her country. Women, they said, had better let politics alone. Mrs. Child was a lady of whom society was exceedingly proud before she published her appeal, and to whom society has been extremely contemptuous ever since. Her works were bought with avidity before, but fell into sudden oblivion. So at that point, the Childs were essentially without income and needed to find another way to keep themselves afloat financially. They both participated in the foundation of the American Anti-Slavery Society. They also helped confront mobs, anti-abolitionist mobs that regularly gathered in Boston to try to stop abolitionist speakers from speaking in Boston. After a couple of years, it became clear that that wasn't enough, and they embarked on a series of experiments, all of which were intended to try to end enslavement. One of the most fascinating is when they moved to Northampton, Massachusetts, to farm sugar beets in an attempt to undermine the cane sugar trade. So the idea was if you could make sugar out of a different substance than sugarcane, the economic bottom would fall out of the slave market, essentially, and then there would be much less reason, much less incentive for people to enslave others. You can see here David Lee Child, her husband, wrote a book about it. He wrote whole diagrams about it. He was the first person to make sugar from beets in this country. Now about 1/3 of our sugar is made from sugar beets. So he wasn't wrong that this was a possibility, but it was definitely an idea whose time had not yet come, and they went bankrupt instead. Around that time, she moved to New York to edit the National Anti-Slavery Standard, which was the publication of the American Anti-Slavery Society. She was the first woman to edit a national political journal like this, and she was in charge of the whole paper with the proviso that her husband was her assistant editor. He was, however, most of the time still in in Western Massachusetts and not much of a help. But this entailed reporting on what was going on in Congress about slavery, reporting about talks that anti-slavery people were giving, also trying to interest people in publications or other facts. And she did this for a couple of years until infighting in the abolitionist movement drove her out. So it's a very sad story, probably isn't unfamiliar, of progressive causes splintering when people disagree about how to fight for whatever cause they love. One of my favorite stories about her, it has to do with John Brown's raid on the armory in Harpers Ferry, Virginia. So probably some of you know John Brown, who's there on your left, decided after a while that words and publications were just not enough, that slavery would only end through violence, and he was going to take on some of the violence himself. So he recruited a band of men, both black and white, and attacked the federal armory in Harpers Ferry with the idea of taking the weapons there and distributing them among enslaved people and inciting a slave rebellion in the hopes of overturning slavery altogether. It also failed. He was arrested, miraculously survived, was in jail. Lydia Maria Child, who was then living in Wayland, Massachusetts, wrote to the governor of Virginia, Henry Wise. I always say this, he looks like he's out of central casting for villains, but he was actually the governor of Virginia, asking permission to come and nurse John Brown in prison. You can imagine this was a fairly audacious request, but Wise said, okay, you can come and nurse him, but he took some time to lecture her as well and said, it's abolitionists like you who have inspired this violence, and you need to take some responsibility for it. Then he published her letter and his letter without her permission in the newspaper. And this meant that her private thoughts, she hadn't intended for that to be public, were blazoned across the South for all to see. She was initially furious about that and then realized that this had given her an enormous opportunity. She had lots of contacts in newspapers as well. So she published a 7-page retort to his letter. That prompted another woman to write back to her and accuse her of all kinds of terrible things. She then wrote back again. This time it was 11 pages. And then the whole thing was published as a tract called Correspondence between Lydia Maria Child and Governor Wise and Mrs. Mason of Virginia. And it sold 300,000 copies, which is the 19th century equivalent of going viral. It distilled her, at this point, this is 1859, so her decades of arguing for abolitionist causes into pithy statements that really roused people in the North in a way that made some people hope that war would not be necessary. I'll just give you one quote, one of my favorite quotes from this. She says to the governor of Virginia, if Captain Brown intended, as you say, to commit treason, robbery, and murder, I think I have shown that he could find ample authority for such proceedings in your public declarations. And she signs that letter, yours with all due respect, L. Maria Child, which I always think is a little bit pointed. So what I want to do now is read a little bit more from the end of the chapter of my book on the Civil War, leading into the chapter on Reconstruction. And again, I do that in part to mark the fact that today is the anniversary of Lee's surrender to Grant. So the chapter that I'll read into is called No Time for Ovations. And this is a picture of Child as she looked around the time the war ended. The first 4 months of 1865 altered the world with lightning speed. On January 31st, the House of Representatives passed the 13th Amendment, bringing slavery one step closer to legal extinction. In March, Lincoln was inaugurated for a second term. In early April, the Confederate capital of Richmond fell and Jefferson Davis fled. Days later, Grant's army, including several Wayland soldiers, finally broke the siege of Petersburg, cutting off Lee's chances of success. By mid-April, the war was over and Lincoln was dead. The Wayland soldiers returned home. On the 4th of July, 1865, the town held a celebration for them, including speeches, hymns, and fireworks. Alpheus Wellington, a Wayland soldier who had written movingly about fighting at Gettysburg, was not there to see them. He had been shot on the final march to Richmond and was buried where he fell. Another soldier was luckier. Found everything as it should be, he wrote in his diary. Am glad to become a citizen once more. Intend to remain one as long as possible. Wayland's most famous resident, having lived to see the end of a 3-decade struggle to free 4 million human beings from enslavement, had a similarly modest goal. I intend to purchase a new bonnet, Maria Child wrote to a friend. I have not had one for 5 years. It might seem that this story should be over. In many of our history books, it is. The war was won, slavery was abolished, the country was moving on. American principles of liberty and independence had prevailed, and the country could go back to being a beacon to other nations. No doubt many Wayland citizens thought exactly this. Perhaps they expressed their righteous relief to the veteran abolitionist in their midst when they encountered her at the library or the general store or in the pews of Wayland's Unitarian Church. If they did, they probably did not get the reply they were expecting. When people ask me if I am not thankful to have lived to see justice done to the Negro, Child reported in the National Anti-Slavery Standard, I reply, if I do live to see justice done to the Negro, I shall be thankful. I imagine the Waylanders receiving this response feeling rebuked, puzzled, perhaps even a little defensive. The North had poured out blood and treasure to win this war. Even if for most of them ending slavery had not been its initial aim, the fact was that the slaves were now free from tyrannical masters, free to find family members who had been sold away, free to work and live by their own wages. They were free, in short, to pursue happiness. What more could they want? I imagine Child's fellow Waylanders walking away, shaking their heads. Some people, it seems, are just never satisfied. Child was so far from being satisfied that she surprised even herself. If I had been told 30 years ago that slavery would be abolished in my day, I should have anticipated such enthusiastic joy as would set me half crazy, she wrote to Sarah Shaw. But what with the frightful expenditure of blood, emancipations being forced upon us by necessity instead of proceeding from the repentance of the nation, and the shameful want of protection to the freedmen since they have been emancipated, there has been no opportunity for any outgushing of joy and exultation. She find, only rejoice with trembling. Not even the new bonnet helped. What kind of country had the martyred Lincoln left to his successor? Post-war questions were daunting. What would the terms of peace be? Would Jefferson Davis be tried for treason? Would General Lee be hanged? When would Southern politicians be allowed back into Congress? And what would they do when they got there? Who would pay for the wartime devastation in the South? And how could the nation's economy recover without unpaid labor? Speaking of unpaid labor, what would the country do with the hundreds of thousands of newly emancipated humans huddled in refugee camps around Union Army bases? What about the millions more just learning they were free? How would they be housed, fed, and protected from the fury of defeated Confederates? Some questions were more philosophical. What did the end of the war mean? Among abolitionists and at least some others in the North, it meant the triumph of principles, of anti-slavery for one, but also of a free labor system that encouraged self-reliance and individualism. For many in the South, it meant no such thing. It simply meant that the North had had more industry, more weapons, more ships, more soldiers. Might had made right. So while many Northerners saw the war's end as an ushering in of an era of progress, many in the South simply wanted their old lives back. Meanwhile, the country began grappling with the meaning of the 13th Amendment. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction, it read. Slavery could now never be instated by any particular state. All Americans, except those convicted of a crime, were now free. It would not take long for new laws to begin criminalizing Black men in overwhelming numbers, effectively enslaving them again. But for now, an even more basic question predominated. What, in the wake of the 13th Amendment, did liberty for all mean? It certainly did not mean justice for all. Freed people would never be compensated for the lifetime of labor that had been stolen from them, or from the physical and emotional torture many endured. Many of them would never find their children, spouses, or parents again. Liberty also did not mean equality. That Black people should not be enslaved did not, in most Americans' minds, imply that they should be citizens or vote. Nor did it guarantee property rights or the right to go to court, sue for damages, or engage in contracts. It did not even guarantee the right to choose where to live. Several Western states continued to pass laws expelling Black settlers or prohibiting new ones from entering. And liberty certainly did not entail social equality, meaning admission to theaters or churches or public transportation. Black Americans would have to fight for every one of those rights, and some white Americans would fight them every step of the way. Some of these fights are still not over. In the face of these realities, freed people were overwhelmingly clear about two things that were, at a minimum, necessary to make their freedom real. One was land. Land would allow them to grow food, establish homes, and begin to build financial security. And there was, as it happened, plenty of land available. Entire plantations had been abandoned by Southern aristocrats as they fled Union armies, their fields left unused and overgrown. In some areas, the experiment was already being tried. In South Carolina, thousands of acres of Confederate property were being farmed by formerly enslaved people as early as 1861. But what would become of this land and the Black farmers working it now that the war was over and plantation owners were coming home? To Maria Child, the solution was obvious. The large plantations ought to be confiscated by the US government, divided into small farms, a certain number of acres given to the soldiers, white and Black, and the remainder sold on easy terms to the poor whites and the emancipated slaves, she wrote. How she wished she simply had land of her own to distribute. Short of that, she donated all the money she could spare to meet the freed people's needs. Grand gestures like her friends the Shaw's orphanage for Black children were beyond her means. But what she lacked in wealth, she tried to make up for with a ferocious work ethic and a kind of exultant frugality. If I have written a story, it has been to create a fund for them. If I have taxed my ingenuity to spend the least possible for food and clothing, it has been for the same purpose, she wrote to the Shaws. Mr. Child says he believes I counterfeit money in some corner of the house, for if I don't, he can't see where it all comes from. She kept what they needed, the rest she gave away. Her contributions, by my calculations, came to the equivalent of 7,000 of today's dollars a year. Her frugality had always been a kind of activism. Now more than ever, a dress mended instead of bought was a statement of principle. Meanwhile, her outmoded clothing was becoming notorious. She wore it like a badge of honor. And then I'm going to skip ahead just a little bit to wrap up with just an image of her in her later years, in her last years, when she and her husband traveled to Boston for the final meeting of the New England Anti-Slavery Society, which was going out of existence after the 15th Amendment was passed and Black men were given the vote. So I love this detail. They arrive at the Horticulture Hall in Massachusetts, having made it through yet another snowstorm. And here's part of what happened next. They must have made quite an impression. By now, a few biographical sketches of Child's life had appeared. Many of the attendees were no doubt eager for a glimpse of the famous but reclusive reformer, whose pen had guided so many of them to opinions that had once seemed radical, but now just made sense. Perhaps next craned to see her greet old friends. Perhaps Child had on her unfashionable bonnet, the one that, as she confessed to another friend, by now could easily have landed her in P.T. Barnum's circus. There was plenty of the crush and confusion she intensely disliked, but finally someone ushered her to the front, and she and David took their place among the abolitionist luminaries on the stage. The first person to speak was Julia Ward Howe, who had written Battle Hymn of the Republic, the song to which many people in the audience would have marched to war and seen their brothers and friends die. But I want to pick up with what she then says about the aging abolitionists behind her. The world was against them, she said, recalling how names like Garrison's and Phillips had been used to conjure monsters in her own childhood home. Nevertheless, she continued, the resolute reformers had conquered as they went. The audience must have been rapt as they looked from the famous speaker to the group of elderly radicals behind her. What a gift to witness these men and women now in life's twilight, to picture them in the early days of passion and outrage, to imagine their bodies pelted with bricks and their pens letting loose the fiery words that had helped change the world. The brave, uncompromising fight they made showed the power of a steadfast faith and will, which their enemies were forced to respect, she heard Howe say. Spring after spring of the human heart was touched by their appeals. Ah, yes, the appeals. One of them had been hers so many years ago. Howe was still talking. And now, to which of us can the word freedom have the same blessed significance as it has to them? She asked the crowd. Only to a few, she concluded. For we have received it as our birthright, but they have given it. The seed of good works is indeed sown on earth in dishonor, but we of today have seen it raised in glory. And now, the orator said, reaching her culmination, the weather-beaten crew, brought home with honor, may rest from this voyage. Dear shall they be to our children's children, dearer to God. I have no doubt that Howe's final words brought the crowd roaring to its feet. As the audience cheered, did the child also rise, perhaps somewhat stiffly in acknowledgement? Did they wave in response, David perhaps more enthusiastically than his wife? The secretary recorded no such details. Neither did Child, with the exception of one brief comment to her friend Lucy Osgood after she and David returned home. Everyone at the meeting, Child confessed to her friend, seemed disposed to make much of us. But when Osgood suggested that Child must have enjoyed the jubilation, Child was quick to correct her. The meeting had emphatically not, she countered, been a final ovation. The news from the South was terrible. Real racial justice was nowhere in sight. The colored people and the loyal white population of the South write to us too many letters describing their persecutions and their dangers and imploring us to stand by them and say for them, which they dare not say for themselves, she wrote. The danger, Child was clear, was existential. A very large number of those masters are determined to exterminate the colored race rather than live on terms of civil equality with them, she wrote. No, the veteran abolitionist concluded, as the 15th Amendment was ratified and the Anti-Slavery Society voted itself out of existence, there is no time for ovations. Last detail about Child's life that I think will bring us full circle is that after the war was over, she returned her energies to thinking about the injustices being done to Native Americans and published another appeal in 1868 called An Appeal for the Indians, which was a desperate attempt to get Congress to pay more attention to some of the atrocities going on then in the West. Lydia Maria Child died in 1880. shortly before she died, she wrote a friend a letter in which she said this: "I think there is more work for me to do in the universe, and that I shall enter upon it with renovated powers." Talk about a Protestant work ethic. She is essentially on her deathbed, hoping that once her body is no longer hindering her, she can continue to work for the causes that she cared about. So this is the inspiration that I take from Child's life, to think of her spirit as continuing to live and work among us. And I'm always grateful for any opportunity to share that vision with others. So thank you so much for your time tonight. And I'm happy to take any questions. I think we have a few minutes, and there may be some on Zoom too, which I'm happy to take. Yeah.
Just away the over the river through the woods.
Oh yes, of course.
What's that story?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, no talk on Lydia Maria Child is complete with it. Yes, she also wrote Over the River and Through the Wood to Grandfather's House We Go. I'm afraid to say it was not the Kennebec River. It was the Mystic River. I have talked to some elementary school teachers in the area here who've been very disappointed to know that. But yeah, that was a wonderful example of her writing for children. And she was so good at that, at encapsulating scenes and evoking them for young people that were also inspiring. And I think she hoped true to sort of American principles that she wanted them to learn as well. I often find it painfully ironic that that is what she is that is what she's famous for, rather. That it's a lovely poem, it's also a very sentimental poem, and that she's famous for that and not for 3 decades of ostracism and radicalness and requiring her fellow Americans to face the ugliest truths about their country. I don't think that irony would have been lost on her. But she was someone who really had an amazing bandwidth. She could do both children's fiction like that and articulate very forceful anti-slavery arguments.
Did she have any children of her own?
She did not. They wanted children. They hoped for children. They never had any. They didn't know why. Neither will we. And that was always a sorrow to her. And later in her life, she talked about being glad on the one hand that not having children had allowed her to engage as fully as she did in these causes. I think she was realistic enough to know that having children would have kept her from engaging the way that she did. But especially in her later years, she certainly regretted that she didn't have children to care for her.
She probably had nieces and nephews from her mother.
She did. Yes, and in fact, some of those did sort of stay by her in her old age, and they were among the people that she left her will to at the end of her life.
You want to speak about why we've never heard of her before?
Yes. Yes, okay, right, thank you. I asked Jeremy to remind me of that, and of course I forget it. Yes, so why is she not famous? Why do we not know more about her? I think there are a lot of reasons. Some of them are sexist, right? Some of them just have to do with the fact that she was a woman. And even though she was famous in her own lifetime, it was convenient for people to forget her fairly quickly after her death, compared to people like William Lloyd Garrison. So when Garrison died, 1,500 people showed up at his funeral, flags flew at half-mast around the country. His children very quickly moved to memorialize him, to write about him. She didn't have children to do that for her. But I think she also had a real reluctance to engage in that kind of what she called lionizing. I think we all know that that can be a trap for women, especially if women are constantly told that it's unladylike to assert your powers and to celebrate your successes, and that being modest and turning the other cheek, as it were, is always the better virtue for women. Then of course you're going to be inclined to do that yourself. But I think she had a deeper worry, which was at the end of the Civil War that white abolitionists would become prominent in the country's history of the anti-slavery movement, to the detriment of the very important Black abolitionists who had started the movement, funded it, kept it going when white abolitionists, including Child, took long breaks because they burned out. And I think she didn't want to have herself in that position. So she refused, and there was something maybe a little contrary in her about this. She refused to have her portrait painted. She refused to have her bust done. She refused requests to do interviews. And when she died, she asked for the plainest, simplest funeral possible. The newspapers were actually sort of shocked and mystified by the fact that someone who was internationally famous like this didn't even want flowers at her funeral. So I think some of those things played into it. I'll mention one other thing. She's hard to classify. And, your question gets to that too. So people say she was a journalist, or she was a reformer. She was a children's author. She was an activist. She was an abolitionist. So I think it's easier to remember people when there's a bumper sticker to remember them by. And since the bumper sticker tends to be over the river and through the wood, why would you take someone like that seriously enough to look into what their political opinions and effect had been? So, but I do a lot of work in 19th century women philosophers, and this is a very familiar story too, that women who were famous thinkers in their own lifetimes were very quickly forgotten. So there are clearly institutionalized forces at work that make that happen more often than not. I think there was another. Oh, there's one, two. I'm trying.
Did she hang out at all with the Skowhegan had a number of really strong abolitionists, Reverend Hathaway and a few others that were, and they were part of the Underground Railroad as well. Did she communicate with them, or was she part of the advent of the New England, the Somerset County?
I don't think so. I don't think she ever came back to Maine after she left as a 20-year-old. So I wouldn't be surprised if she corresponded with some of those people, especially when she was editing the National Anti-Slavery Standard. So that would have been exactly the kind of thing that she would have chronicled in the paper. This society is starting out. This person has given this lecture. This person is doing good things. But I don't know that for a fact. So that would be something good to look into. Yeah. But yeah, there is wonderful, I'm sure you know this, history of abolitionism in Maine. I've been reading a lot about, there's a serial article being published in the Ballard on abolitionism in Maine that I highly recommend if you're curious about that. Other questions? All right. Well, thank you again so much for being here. And if you're someone who enjoys history or knows people who do, especially women's history, Civil War history, the paperback will be out soon. This is sort of the last group of hardbacks that I have. They're $25. They're usually $35. So, and I will use the money to a good cause, as inspired by Lydia Maria Child. So thank you again so much, and enjoy the rest of this beautiful evening.